This is a presentation of the findings from research examining new church plants and their practices in developing the people they serve. There are two reasons I decided to focus on church plants. One, I'm currently a member of a church plant, and I feel the findings of this research may directly benefit our community. And secondly, my interest in planting stems from my tenure at my former organization, InterVarsity, where I helped plant several new student movements across the Midwest region. The purpose of this research is to do a qualitative study that looked at the practices of 5 successful church planters in the Evangelical Covenant Denomination. How did they develop and manage their people? Were there any themes or patterns across these 5 cases? The hope was to uncover best human resource development strategies in planting and to lay a foundation and develop more specific categories for potential future quantitative studies. The following questions were asked in this research project. What makes a plant successful? What critical knowledge, skills, and abilities are developed in members of successful churches? And how do these members attain these KSAs? Why are these questions relevant and important? The survival rate of churches, based off of a report spanning 2000 to 2005, is a mere 68%. Of the 4,000 new churches established, 3,700 closed. Church access is being outpaced by the population growth in the U.S. Of the 68 million people born in the U.S. since 1990 and the 23 million immigrants we've received in that time frame, many people just don't have access to church simply because there isn't one that relates to them or speaks their language. This, in addition to the high cost in time, money, and human energy it is to start a church, seems wise to get a clear understanding on best practices that help churches become more sustainable. What are key terms? Human resource development. This is practices that address people issues in an organization, from management to recruitment to development. In this paper, I focused mainly on development and less so on the former two. Under this term, I'm incorporating the Christian term discipleship, which refers to practices that help an individual grow their faith, deepen their understanding of the personhood of Jesus, and holistically integrate their spiritual practice into all aspects of their lives. The next term is organizational life cycle. This is a term that refers to the theory that all organizations transition through varying levels of maturity as they age. A life cycle model is used to describe the different growth stages of the organization. In the literature review, I found that there was very little empirical research regarding the church planting process. So I broadened my search based on the life stage of an organization. This is where the term organizational life cycle comes into play. In the case of this research, I looked for literature writing about development of organizations between startup stage 1 to growth stage 2, and I was able to find more. However, my source literature regarding organizational life stage were mainly focused on for-profit companies with different goals of development than a nonprofit community-based church. So these sources needed a little bit of translation in order to be relevant for the nonprofit religious sector that I was interested in. Additionally, I examined sources writing about church planting theory. These were mainly non-empirical, non-research-oriented sources. So in order to frame and narrow the research, I compared major themes from both sets relevant to human resource development in church planting. I found 3 major themes of human resource development that contributed to an organization's stability. 1. Founder delegation. Literature suggests that organizations that successfully navigate the transition from stage 1 to stage 2 will have founders that are able to shift roles. They're able to move from a do-it-all-yourself role to sharing significant leadership load with others. In other words, from solo leading to team leading. 2. Informal and non-formal training. Literature indicates that human resource development becomes significantly more crucial in stage 2, where the organization is growing and the sheer numbers are just harder to manage. However, because the organization is still emerging, formal training is less relied upon. Instead, informal and non-formal training is used to help manage members. This training is often hands-on in nature with some focus on mentorship and peer assistance. And finally, socialization. Successful organizations help new members acclimate and find their place in the organizational culture. In stage 2, where human resources are still limited, it is extremely important for this process to happen quickly and effectively so new members can become contributors as early as possible. I chose to approach this research using grounded theory method mainly because the HRD themes found in literature do not give adequate empirical evidence for validity. So instead of looking for the themes that I found in the literature, I wanted to interview church planting pastors surrounding the issue of development, mainly to see what themes inductively emerged. Would the emergent themes parallel the literature, or are they new practices and themes that are noteworthy? I chose a qualitative study because, like I mentioned before, there isn't enough evidence that theories found in the literature are applicable to church planting context, and there isn't enough empirical data that can warrant a quantitative study regarding these themes and their correlation to growth and success. In my data collection, I did purposeful sampling of 5 different successful Evangelical Covenant or ECC church plants. 5 planting pastors within the ECC that are leading churches deemed by the denomination to be successful plants. The denomination labels success as having a combination of numerical growth, financial independence, and official membership within the denomination. In order to become denominational members, church plants need to undergo a rigorous assessment by denominational leadership. Each of my interviews lasted from between 45 minutes to an hour and were conducted either face-to-face or over the phone. My interview questions focused on 3 areas: the background of the planter, the history of the church plant, and the parishioner or member development strategy. There were 6 open-ended questions with a variety of follow-ups. Data analysis. All interviews were coded line by line for themes and were analyzed using constant comparison technique and memoing. All 5 plants exhibited many commonalities regarding what they wanted to develop in their members. 3 qualities or values emerged as priorities. 1. A value for diversity, that is, a deepened understanding and concern for those who are different than oneself. Number 2. A value for missional culture. That is, a lifestyle that reflects Jesus' mission to share the love of God to all people through word and deed. And lastly, a value for a personal relationship with Jesus. In other words, that members grow in the belief that they have a relationship with God. Several themes also emerge regarding how these values would be instilled. This I organized through the terms of informal and non-formal learning environments based off of Combs' theory. Informal learning is spontaneous and unstructured and happens in the learner's everyday context. Non-formal learning is sponsored by an organization, and in our case, the church, and generally has a specific curriculum that is short-term, voluntary, and occurs in a public place. The term formal learning is not relevant here because the churches that we were looking at are not educational institutions or schools. Additionally, these strategies can be classified as communal or individual. Communal meaning happening in the context of a larger group, and individual meaning happening in a one-on-one context. Major themes that emerged from the developmental strategies were socialization to the culture of the community. This meant that the values of the church was being demonstrated by the community, and anyone who interacted with the community would be affected by it. Some examples of this are hospitality, a community that has a purpose or a serving target, a community that's generous or invitational, etc. Another theme that emerged was one-on-one pastoral care. This strategy was expressed through casual meetings with the pastor and church leadership with various members of the church. The purpose of these meetings would vary. However, within this strategy, church planners reported similar practices of counseling, coaching, and personal invitation to take risks or the next step for development. Another developmental strategy used was the Sunday preaching. All the pastors recognized that the Sunday message was an important learning tool for members to hear and be invited to imbibe the church's values and practices. Another strategy that emerged as a theme was learning communities. Many pastors said that the smaller group communities formed out of the larger congregation were really significant places to develop members. These are places where individuals could learn life and ministry skills and explore biblical texts as they apply to everyday life. These communities were effective because they allowed individuals to feel more personally connected to the community at large and to have collaborators and partners in their faith practice. The last theme that emerged was leadership development. Lastly, pastors reported the need and importance for spending a lot of effort in developing their leaders. The development practices ranged, of course, but many of the pastors reported strategies such as modeling, coaching, hands-on experience that would be used to help these leaders care for and support the congregation at large. Most of these developmental moments with leaders would occur in one-on-one sessions with the pastor as places for debrief regarding the ongoing programs or ministries. Lastly, how these strategies were executed also shared many similarities. By and large, the lion's share of the developmental strategies were done personally by the church planter themselves. Some of them reported having one or two partners, but even so, the majority of the developmental strategies' execution lied with them. This large load, understandably, would not be feasible in the long run as the churches continued to grow. For this reason, several planters emphasized the need to identify and recruit leadership partners early on in order to have long-term sustainability. One pastor in particular reported saying that recruitment and maintaining quality partners was his primary focus for his job. And many reported that leadership development was actually one of their primary strategies in developing their people as a whole. So in conclusion, I want to return back to the research questions in this study. What makes a plant successful? In this research, I discovered that in this ECC, success was defined by growth, financial independence, and membership. However, during the interviews, it was interesting to note that several pastors had differing ideas of what success means for them. For 2 out of the 5 interviews, numerical growth was not as significant a factor as transformation. And this was reflected in these pastors' developmental strategies as well as in their church's growth rate. In looking at the second question, what critical knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSAs, are developed in members of the successful churches? I found it interesting that in these 5 success cases, the types of KSAs that these churches decided to focus on were quite similar. I discovered that these 5 churches shared similar developmental goals. They all wanted their congregants to 1. Value diversity, 2. See mission and service as a form of discipleship, and 3. Have a personal relationship with Jesus. Whether or not these developmental goals contributed to the success of the churches is beyond the limited scope of this study. However, it would be interesting fodder for future studies regarding these developmental goals and their correlation to a church's success. And the final question, how do the members attain these knowledge, skills, and attitudes? Again, there were several emergent themes regarding how each successful plant developed their members. It was interesting to note that some of these themes aligned with the literature. For example, we found alignment in the fact that the primary development mechanisms relied on non-formal and informal training. Additionally, there was alignment in the usage of community or socialization as a primary tool for development. Areas of less alignment with the literature were that the planters reported less, quote, founder delegation than I expected. I wonder whether this has to do with power and how power is structured in a for-profit organization versus a church. For example, mentorship was mainly based on relationship versus delegation or assignment to a boss. Additionally, almost all of the interviewees reported a level of, quote, organic strategy. In other words, there was less intentional programming and systematic teaching, and more subtle demonstrative behavior and this infusing of values into the culture at large. For the discussion and implications of this study, as mentioned before, the term, quote, success is too ambiguous. In future study, it might behoove the researcher to define interview questions more strictly along pre-established definition of success. That being said, it would be important to resolve the issue between quantity versus quality, or growth in numbers versus individual transformation in the definition. Defining success along either of these lines can help firm up any correlational relationship between HRD, strategy, and success. Secondly, the purpose of this research was not to establish direct correlation between HRD and success. However, it did uncover several patterns that seemed to be shared by all 5 success stories. Therefore, to further the research, it would be interesting to broaden the sample size and do a quantitative study along the lines of these HRD practices and their relationship to growth. I say growth because this is far easier to measure than individual transformation, but understandably, this may not paint the fullest picture of successful planting. The experience of learning from these 5 extraordinary and passionate pastors was a meaningful one. It is my hope that this research may prove to be helpful and a foundational stepping stone to broader and more extensive studies of church planting in the ECC. Thank you so much for listening. In the final screenshot, I've attached my reference page.